The old white woman pointed at him like he'd tracked mud onto her marble floor and said the cruelest thing a stranger ever said to Marcus Okonkwo. "Fix my husband's Rolls-Royce, boy, and I'll let you marry my daughter." She smirked. Her diamond earrings caught the Georgia sun. Marcus stood there in his oil-stained blue coveralls, flashlight warm in his calloused hand. A 46-year-old black single father bent over the open engine of a 1965 Silver Cloud. He didn't flinch. He didn't answer, because he already knew the daughter watching from those steps. And Eleanor Ashworth had no idea who he was. Marcus Okonkwo was 46 years old, and he fixed cars that most people had quietly given up on. Not the new ones full of computers, though he could handle those when a customer pushed him into it. He meant the old ones, the pre-war Bentleys, with their hand-stitched leather, the mid-century Rolls-Royces, built in an era when craftsmen still signed their work somewhere invisible. The big American luxury machines from the 50s and 60s, assembled by men who were all in the ground now. It was a dying trade. Across the country, there were maybe a few hundred mechanics left who could do it the right way, and the number shrank every year. His father had taught him in a one-bay garage in a small Alabama town, with a dirt lot and a hand-painted sign and a Coca-Cola cooler that wheezed in the corner. His father's hands were in everything Marcus knew how to do. Sometimes, bent over an engine, he would close his eyes and swear the hands moving the wrench were not his own. His father had also taught him another thing, though never with words. The summer Marcus turned 11, the two of them had walked into a roadside cafe after a long day on a tow call, and the waitress had looked at them and then looked past them, and a man behind the counter had said, very politely, that the kitchen was closed. The kitchen was not closed. Marcus had watched a white family receive plates of meatloaf. 10 minutes later, his father had paid for their 2 coffees, tipped the waitress $1, and walked his son back to the truck without a single word. The silence on the ride home had taught Marcus more about what kind of man to be than any sermon ever did. He worked alone now, out of a shop on the edge of Savannah, Georgia. Concrete floor swept twice a day. The smell of motor oil and old leather that had become so much the smell of his own life that he could no longer detect it. His wife Grace had died 5 years ago. It had not been sudden. It had been the long kind of dying, the kind that gives you months to say everything and somehow leaves you certain you said nothing right. Grace had looked at him one afternoon near the end, clear-eyed the way she got when the morphine was wearing off, and she had said the thing that still sat inside his chest like a nail that had never been pulled. "Marcus, baby, you can fix anything with a bolt in it, but you let the things that actually matter rust. You will rebuild a stranger's engine for a month, and you will not have one honest conversation with your own son." He had told her she was being unfair. She had smiled at him the way you smile at a person who is going to understand you eventually, just not in time for it to do either of you any good. Their son Daniel was 22 now, the first Okonkwo who had ever finished college. Business degree, up in Atlanta. Walked the stage in May. On the Monday, before the Ashworth call came in, Marcus had been under a 1948 Bentley when his phone buzzed on the bench. Daniel's name on the screen. He had stood up, wiped his hands on a shop rag, watched the phone vibrate for 4 long rings, and let it go to voicemail. Then he had stood there in the middle of the shop, in the silence after, until the buzzing was completely gone. The call from the Ashworth estate came in on a Tuesday afternoon, the 2nd week of October. A lawyer's voice, very smooth, very careful, the kind of voice that bills its clients in 15-minute increments. Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth had a vehicle in need of restoration. A 1965 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud III. The car had not run in 7 years. 4 previous specialists had been unable to return it to service. Marcus listened with the phone tucked against his shoulder. He asked who the 4 had been. The lawyer named them. A restoration shop in Atlanta, a father and son operation up in Charleston, a consultant flown in from a Rolls-Royce Mark Club in New Jersey, a retired master technician from Birmingham. All 4 men were white. All 4 were respected. And all 4 had reached the same impossible conclusion. There was nothing mechanically wrong with the car that they could find. It simply would not run. Marcus told the lawyer he would come Thursday. He knew the name Ashworth. the way everyone in his part of Georgia knew it. Old Savannah money. The kind that had a pew with a brass plate at the cathedral, a wing of the children's hospital, and 3 centuries of opinions about precisely who belonged where and beside whom. He had read the name in the society pages for 30 years, and he knew it for one other reason, a private one he had not spoken out loud in more than 2 decades, and did not intend to start speaking now. Thursday morning he loaded his diagnostic kit into the bed of his pickup and turned in at a gate that bore no number. Only the small initial A worked into the iron. The drive was crushed oyster shell, and the live oaks on either side were so old their branches had grown down to touch the ground and bent back up again. Spanish moss hung off them like gray lace. He pulled around the last curve, and the house came into view. White limestone, 4 stories, a portico with columns thick as cypress trunks. Standing at the top of the front steps was a thin black man in a black jacket and white gloves, with the careful posture of someone who had spent decades being invisible in rooms that required him. A delivery van was already parked in the front courtyard. A white electrician in a backwards baseball cap was carrying a coil of wire up the front steps. The butler did not stop him. The butler stopped Marcus. He stepped down to the truck window with a polite, practiced smile and said, in a soft voice, "Sir, deliveries and the trades enter by the side. The service drive runs around to the carriage house. If you follow the gravel to the left, you will see the door." He did not look at the electrician on the steps. He did not need to. They both understood, the butler and Marcus, the precise contour of what was being said and what was not. Marcus felt his jaw set, hard as cast iron. He nodded once, put the truck in gear, and drove the long way around. Halfway up the rear service drive, he glanced up at the house. A woman was standing at a second-floor window, looking down. He could not see her face clearly, only the still shape of her, hands folded, watching his truck. The shape held there long enough that he felt it, then it moved away from the glass. He did not know her. She did not know him. 22 years can do that to 2 people. Eleanor Ashworth met him on the rear steps of the carriage house instead of the front porch. She was 73 years old, slim as a riding crop, with pewter hair pulled into a low chignon, a cream silk blouse, and a string of pearls her grandmother had probably worn to a debutante ball. She did not invite him into the house. She did not offer him water or shade. She stood 3 steps above him, so he had to look up to her, and she let her eyes travel slowly down his oil-stained coveralls and back up to his face. Marcus watched her arrive at a complete and final conclusion about him in about the time it takes a man to take one good breath. Then she said it, "Well, fix my husband's Rolls-Royce, boy, and I'll let you marry my daughter." She said it the way a queen tosses a coin to a beggar. A small, dry smile, a tilt of the head. The word boy, laid down so easily, it could only have come from a woman of her generation, who had grown up calling grown black men boy, and had never had to apologize for any of it in 73 years. The cruelty was double-stitched. There was the class of it, and there was the race of it, reinforcing each other like 2 strands of barbed wire on the same fence. Marcus felt the heat climb the back of his neck. He did not let it reach his face. His father had taught him that too, in the parking lot of a roadside cafe in Alabama, a long time ago. "I'll take a look at the car, ma'am," he said. His voice was flat and even, like a torque wrench reading exactly the spec on the label. "We can talk about my rate after I know what I'm dealing with." Eleanor blinked. It was the smallest of pauses, but it was a pause she had not been expecting. She was not used to being answered, as if the joke had simply failed to land. She recovered in less than a second, but Marcus saw it. Behind her, the front door opened, and a woman stepped out onto the upper veranda. She was 46, blonde, gone soft at the temples, in a pale linen shift. She stopped at the top of the steps and looked down at the rear courtyard, and Marcus felt something he had not felt in 22 years travel up his spine in one clean line. She walked down the side stairs slowly. She did not look at her mother. She looked at him. "Have we met before?" she said. It was not quite a question. It was the half-formed memory of a question. "A long time ago, ma'am," Marcus said. Her mouth opened to ask the next thing. He looked away first, on purpose, and turned to follow Eleanor toward the carriage house. Eleanor swung the heavy door open. The silver cloud sat in the middle of the bay, under a fitted cover. When she drew the cover back, Marcus felt the small private thing he always felt with these old machines: reverence. A small bow in the spine. The car was midnight blue. The spirit of ecstasy on the nose leaned into a wind that had stopped blowing 7 years ago. The tires had gone flat and square at the bottom from sitting. "My husband loved this car more than he loved most people," Eleanor said quietly. 4 experts could not bring it back. They told me it was being difficult on purpose, as though a car could be. Marcus laid his open palm on the cool metal of the hood. The carriage house was still, but the metal seemed to hum under his hand, like something holding a breath it had been holding for a very long time. His father had a saying: "A car that should run and doesn't is not a mystery. It's a message. Your job is to get quiet enough to hear what." The first week, he did exactly what the 4 other men must have done. You start with the obvious. He went through the fuel system, the ignition, the electrical, the carburetors. The more he looked, the stranger it became, because the car was magnificent. Charles Ashworth had maintained it with real love right up until the month he died. The fuel lines were clean. The wiring was sound. There was no rot, no rodent damage. He pulled the plugs, and they were good. He ran a compression test, and the numbers came back on all 6 cylinders, strong and even, like 6 notes of music played in tune. There was spark. There was fuel in the tank. Old, but not yet turned to varnish. By every measurement Marcus knew how to take, and he knew how to take a great many. That car should have started on the 2nd crank. It would not so much as cough. While he worked, a memory kept finding him. 22 years ago, he had been a younger man, the same height and roughly the same weight he was now, but with no gray and a far easier laugh. He had been working the floor at a restoration shop on the south side of Savannah, finishing the trade his father had half taught him, and a young woman named Catherine Ashworth had begun bringing in a temperamental little British racing green MG Roadster that her father had given her for her 21st birthday. The MG was always needing something. She had been 24 years old. He had been 24 years old. She was an Ashworth. He was a mechanic's son with grease worked into the lines of his knuckles. By every rule of how Savannah was built and how Savannah worked, absolutely nothing was supposed to happen between them. But she had lingered. That was how it had started. She would drop the MG off, and then she would not leave. She would lean on the fender in the long Georgia afternoon and ask him real questions. How does this work? Why did you do it that way and not the other way? What made you fall in love with this? And he had answered her, because no one had ever asked him those things as if they actually wanted to know. It had lasted 1 summer. They had thought they were careful. For 3 months he had believed, with the particular stupidity of being 24 and in love, that the rules did not apply to them. Then Eleanor had found out, and a week after that, a soft-spoken lawyer had come to the shop and reminded Marcus, very gently, that he had a future to think about, and that Catherine had a future, and that the 2 futures did not intersect, and never would. A month later, Catherine had been sent to relatives in Virginia. He had written 1 letter. He did not know if she had ever received it. He came back to the present, standing beside the silver cloud, with a vacuum gauge in his hand, and he heard the side door of the carriage house creak open. Catherine stepped inside, carrying a tall glass of sweet tea, beaded with condensation. She set it on the workbench, without a word. She stood in the doorway, watching him work. 10 minutes, maybe more. Neither of them spoke. Marcus did not turn around. He felt her shadow shorten on the concrete floor as the afternoon sun shifted, and he kept his eyes on the engine, because if he turned, he would break, and he had not given himself permission to break in years. Eventually, her shadow withdrew. The door clicked shut. The tea sat sweating on the bench until the ice melted clean. By the end of the first week, Marcus had reached exactly where the 4 other men must have reached. The edge of the explainable. He could have written his diagnostic invoice, told Eleanor he was sorry, but the fault was not findable, and driven back to Savannah, a poorer man and a wiser one. There is no shame in admitting that a machine has outsmarted you, but his father's saying kept coming back to him in the cold of the carriage house. Not as advice, as an instruction. So on Monday morning of the 2nd week, he changed his approach. He stopped, trying to make the car start. He put down the diagnostic computer and the multimeter and the timing light, and he laid his hands on the engine, and he started listening. It took 2 days. He read the car the way a man reads a long letter from someone he loves. He traced every system by hand, his bare fingers following each fuel line, each vacuum hose, each braided wire. He was looking for a wrong note in a song he half knew. On the afternoon of the second day, low on the engine and toward the front, his fingers found it. The fuel shutoff mechanism was a small brass governor that controlled the flow of fuel to the carburetors. This one had not failed. This one had been set. Someone had reached in with a small wrench and adjusted it so that it sat almost, but not quite, closed. Just enough that fuel would seem to be available, and yet never quite arrive in the volume the engine needed to fire. No single component was faulty. They had simply been told, by a knowing hand, to work against one another. Marcus sat back on his heels on the cold concrete and felt the hair lift on his forearms. There was a world of difference between a part that had failed and a part that had been set. A failure was random, but this was a decision. Someone had made certain that it would never run again, in a way that would read to any honest mechanic as a phantom fault. There was exactly one person on this earth who had known the Silver Cloud well enough to do that. The man who had died the same month it had stopped running. Charles Ashworth had disabled his own beloved car, on purpose, with his own hands, as one of the last things he had ever done. Marcus was still sitting on his heels when the side door of the carriage house creaked open again. Catherine came in without speaking. She crossed the bay slowly, sat down on the old wooden stool by the workbench, and rested her hands flat on her knees. The afternoon light was going amber through the high windows. She looked at the open hood of her father's car. "Marcus," she said. It was the first time she had used his name out loud since she had walked down those veranda steps. "I have to tell you something." He set the wrench down on a rag and turned toward her on the heels of his boots and waited. "My mother sent me to Virginia that summer because of you. I know you knew that part already, but I do not think you knew the actual reason." She drew in a slow breath. "Mama did not send me away because you were poor. She did not send me away because you were a mechanic. She sent me away because you were black. She said it in our living room, before she closed the door. She told my father, with me standing right there, that no daughter of hers was going to ruin 3 centuries of this family by marrying a colored man. Those were her exact words. I have remembered them for 22 years. Marcus did not speak. He could not. Catherine did not cry. The tears just arrived, sitting in the lower lids of her eyes without falling, the way tears do when a person has carried something for too long to perform it anymore. He held the silence with her. There were things only silence could hold up. That evening, after Catherine had gone back across the gravel to the big house, Marcus stayed in the carriage house with the doors open to the cool blue dusk. He needed to know one more thing. A man does not kill the thing he loves most for no reason at all. A man does it as a message. Marcus intended to finish listening. He followed the fuel system back upstream, past where any routine repair would ever take a mechanic, into a small access cavity tucked up against the firewall. The fasteners had been wiped clean. The grime around them had built up undisturbed for years, but the fasteners themselves were bright in the beam of his flashlight, as though they had been recently turned. Someone had been in there last, and meant for it to stay closed until the right person came. He took out his 1/4-inch driver and broke the seal. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with brown twine, was a flat metal tin about the size of a hardback book. He lifted it out into the light. Across the top, in fading fountain pen ink, in a careful old-fashioned hand, was a single word. Catherine. Marcus knelt there on the cold concrete, with the tin in his 2 greasy hands, and he felt the last 22 years of his life quietly rearrange themselves around him, like furniture being moved in the dark. He understood what Charles Ashworth had done. Charles had hidden a letter to his daughter inside the one object on this earth that he knew his family would never throw away. He had locked it inside a machine that only a true craftsman could reach, and to make sure someone would one day have to dig this deep, Charles had reached in and stopped the car from running. The dead car was not broken. It was a locked box The broken engine was the lock, and the key was a kind of person, not a kind of tool. Marcus did not open the tin. It was not his to open. He carried it carefully across the courtyard in the falling light and asked the butler if Mrs. Ashworth could see him. He found Eleanor in the garden room, sitting in a wicker chair with a book of poems on her lap that she clearly had not been reading. He held the tin against his chest, where she could see the name on it, but not yet touch it. He asked her, as gently as he knew how, whether her daughter Catherine was still living. The question went through Eleanor like a current. He watched her shoulders flinch under the silk. "She is in Charleston," Eleanor said. Her voice was very level. "We are not close. We have not spoken in some years." "Since Mr. Ashworth passed?" Marcus asked. "Before that." She did not elaborate. Marcus could read the shape of a long, quiet feud in the set of her jaw. He told her then that he had found something inside the car that it had her daughter's name on it, written in her late husband's hand, hidden where only the restoration itself could have found it, and that he believed Mr. Ashworth had meant it to travel to Catherine by exactly this road. Eleanor's first instinct was that of a woman who had spent 7 decades controlling everything within reach. She put out her hand for the tin, palm up, an old habit of command. Marcus did not give it to her. He said, as respectfully as he knew how, that he was not the man who would overrule the last careful plan of a man on his deathbed. For a long moment, those pale, unbending eyes held him, and then something cracked, very faintly, at the edge of them, the kind of hairline crack he spent his life finding in cast iron. Her hand lowered. She looked down at her lap, and she said, almost to herself, "Charles always did love that girl more than he loved me, especially at the end." It took Marcus 3 days to find a current telephone number for Catherine Ashworth. She had remarried briefly and gone back to her own name after the divorce. He finally got the number through a parts supplier in Mount Pleasant. He sat in the cab of his pickup outside his shop on a Wednesday evening and dialed it. A woman's voice answered. "Hello, Catherine," he said. "This is Marcus Okonkwo." The silence on the line was so long he thought she had hung up. He pulled the phone away from his ear to check. The call was still connected. Then, into that silence, she said one word. "Marcus." Just that. Just his name. The way a person says a name they have not allowed themselves to say out loud in a very long time. She drove up from Charleston that Saturday morning. He was already in the carriage house when she arrived. He heard the gravel under her tires, then her footsteps on the brick apron, then on the wooden threshold. He did not turn around. His hands were on a wrench, and he kept them there. There was a long pause. Then he heard her draw in a small, broken breath, and he heard her laugh and start to cry at the same time, the way a person does when a memory walks into a room and reveals itself to have been physically real all along. He turned. She was standing there with one hand pressed flat over her mouth. They were both 46. The girl of 24 was not in the room. The woman she had become was, but the way she was looking at him in his coveralls, in his exact place beside an open hood, was the way she had looked at him a lifetime ago, and Marcus understood that whatever had been real between them that summer had not actually died. It had only been doing what the car had been doing, waiting. He picked up the tin and crossed the bay to her and put it in her hands. He told her where he had found it and what he had worked out about why. Then he stepped out into the courtyard, pulled the door most of the way closed, and stood under the live oaks and let her read her father's letter alone. She came out almost an hour later. Her eyes were swollen. She was holding the open letter against her chest, the way a person holds something against the wind. She told him what it said. Not all of it. Some of it was hers and would stay hers. But the heart of it she gave to him, because the heart of it concerned him too. Charles Ashworth had known he was dying when he wrote it. He had known that his wife and his daughter had been torn apart years before over Catherine's choices, over a young black mechanic one long ago summer, and over Eleanor's unbending certainty about who her daughter was permitted to be. Charles had spent his entire marriage keeping the peace by saying nothing, and he had died, knowing that his silence had cost him the 2 people he loved most. The letter was his apology. A dying man telling his daughter in ink the things he had been too much of a coward to say with his own voice, that he had been wrong to stay silent, that he had loved her exactly as she was, that he was so deeply sorry, and that he hoped, Whoever found this would have the decency to carry it to her. There was one line, Catherine said, that she wanted Marcus to hear in her father's words, not in hers. She read it aloud, standing in the courtyard with the light coming down through the live oaks. I could not mend what I broke while I was alive. So I have hidden this inside the one thing I trust to outlast me, and I will let a better man's hands carry it the rest of the way. A better man's hands. Charles had been dead 7 years before Marcus ever laid a finger on the silver cloud. And somehow, across all that time, a man Marcus had never met had written a part into his last act for a stranger to come along, in his own good time, and play. Catherine took the letter to her mother that same evening. Marcus was not in the room. It was not his place to be, but Catherine told him afterward, in pieces, what had been said and what had been left unsaid, and he carried the rough outline of it back across the courtyard in his head every morning when he walked into the carriage house to finish the work. The two women had sat across from each other at the long mahogany table in the formal dining room. Eleanor had insisted on the formal dining room, perhaps because she did not know how else to receive a thing of this size. The letter had been placed flat on the table between them, like a third person who had finally decided to tell the truth out loud after sitting silent at every meal for 22 years. Eleanor had read it twice, the first time in tight, controlled silence, the second time more slowly. When she had finished, she had taken off her reading glasses, folded them, set them down on the polished wood, and begun to weep. Marcus would have bet his entire shop, his tools, his pickup, and his good name that Eleanor Ashworth did not have any tears left anywhere inside her. He would have lost. She had wept for a long time without making any sound at all, which was the worst kind of weeping. And then she had said the thing Catherine had spent her entire adult life waiting to hear, and had long ago stopped expecting. I am sorry. It was not, in the first instance, for the letter. It was not even, in the first instance, for the years of silence. It was for the original wound under all of those years. If he had been white, Eleanor had said, looking down at her own hands on the table, if your young man that summer had been a poor white boy from a poor white family, I think I would have made it difficult for you for a few months. I would have sent him warning letters. I would have introduced you to suitable boys at the country club. I would have made his life hard enough that he eventually walked away on his own. But I would not have moved heaven and earth to destroy it. I would not have called a lawyer. I would not have shipped you out of the state in a week. I did all of that because he was black. I did all of that because I could not bear the thought. And I want you to know that I have known for some time now that this made me a smaller and uglier woman than I was raised to believe I was. And I am sorry. I am so sorry. Catherine had not answered for a long time. There was nothing fast you could answer such a sentence with. In the carriage house the next morning, while Marcus undid what Charles had so carefully done, removing the small, deliberate adjustment from the fuel shutoff and restoring the brass governor to true, Catherine sat in the passenger seat of the Silver Cloud with the door open and her bare feet up on the running board. She did not say much. Every so often, when his hand drifted out from under the open hood, she would lay a wrench or a feeler gauge into his palm, without being asked. Exactly the right tool, exactly the right size. The summer of 1990-something, in the back of a different shop, with a different green roadster on the lift, came back into the room without anyone calling it. Neither of them said so. They were not fixing the car anymore. Exactly. They were both old enough now to know that. It was a cool, bright morning in the second week of November. The big doors of the carriage house stood open to the smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney and the calling of jays in the live oaks. Marcus had been there since before sunrise. He had gone over the engine one last time the way a pilot walks an airplane. He had checked the fluids and topped the radiator with distilled water. He sat down in the cracked leather. He put both hands on the wheel. He felt the steel of it through his palms, cool and round and right. He turned the key. The starter motor caught. The fuel pump primed. The 6 cylinders hesitated for a single beat, the way old engines do when they have been waiting a long time and need a moment to remember themselves. And then the 1965 Silver Cloud came alive. It did not roar. These cars did not roar. It would have been beneath them. It came alive, with a sound like a long, deep, contented breath, smooth and low, and impossibly dignified. The sound of something built by hand to outlast every person who would ever touch it. Marcus felt it in his chest more than he heard it. 7 years of silence, walked quietly out of the building, and did not come back. Eleanor was standing in the open doorway. He did not know how long she had been there. She had one thin hand pressed flat against the wooden doorframe, as though she needed it to keep her upright. She was wearing a wool cardigan over her shoulders against the morning. Her face was the face of a woman who had not allowed herself to believe this was actually going to happen until the moment it did. She walked across the bay slowly. Marcus shut off the engine and stepped out of the car and stood by the open driver's door. Eleanor walked all the way up to him, and she held out her hand. He took it. Her grip was stronger than he would have guessed. She held on. "Mr. Okonkwo," she said, "I owe you 2 apologies, though you only know about one." He waited. "I owe you an apology for what I said to you on the rear steps of this carriage house 6 weeks ago. I knew exactly what I was doing when I said it. I did it because I did not want to admit to anyone that I had recognized you before you climbed out of the truck. The years had taken some of you, but they had not taken all of you. I knew you the moment you stepped down, and I said what I said to keep you in a place where I would not have to think about what I had done 22 years ago. That is the second apology. I owe it to you for that summer, for the lawyer, for my daughter's exile, for all of it. I have owed it for a very long time." Marcus did not speak. There were no fast words for such a sentence. Catherine was standing a few steps behind her mother now. She had come in quietly through the side door without anyone hearing her. She did not say anything either. She simply walked up behind Eleanor and laid one hand, lightly, on her mother's shoulder. It was the first time the 2 women had touched in more than 20 years. Marcus closed the hood of the Silver Cloud with a soft, sure click, and he looked at the 3 of them standing there in the November light, and he understood that none of the repairs being made in that carriage house anymore had anything to do with the car. He drove home to Savannah late that afternoon with the windows of his pickup down and the sound of the Silver Cloud's engine still beating somewhere under his ribs. He had been paid well, in a check that Eleanor had handed him personally with both hands. He did not think about the money. He thought about Charles Ashworth. He thought about a man who had kept the peace in his own house his entire life by saying nothing. A man so afraid of his wife's disapproval that he had let his daughter be exiled, rather than say the simple sentence he could have said. A man who had died with that silence still lodged in his throat. A man who, in the last weeks of his life, had been reduced to hiding his apology inside an engine and praying that a stranger would deliver it after he was gone. And then Marcus thought about Grace. In a hospital bed in Savannah, 5 years ago, his wife had looked at him and told him that he would rebuild a stranger's engine for a month and not have one honest conversation with his own son. He had told her she was being unfair. She had smiled at him. That night, in the kitchen of the small brick house he had shared with Grace for 19 years, Marcus picked up his phone and called his son. Daniel answered on the second ring. His voice was alarmed. Seen his for night away, if everything was all right, because his father calling at night for no reason had not been a thing that happened in 5 years. Marcus had to steady himself before he could speak, because the sound of his son's worry was already breaking him. He told Daniel he was sorry. He told him he had vanished into the work after Grace died, and that he had left his boy alone inside his own grief, because he had no idea how to be inside his own. He told Daniel he was proud of him, proud of the degree, proud of the man he had become, proud in a way he had been feeling for years and had never managed to push out through his mouth. There was a long silence on the line, and then Daniel said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "I have been waiting a long time to hear that, Dad." They talked for 2 hours, the first honest 2 hours they had had in 5 years. Daniel was coming down to Savannah the following month, and the 2 of them were going to find a cheap old car and fix it together in the shop. Not because either of them needed a car, because they both needed the hours next to each other. Charles Ashworth had hidden his apology inside an engine because he had run out of time to deliver it himself. Marcus was not out of time. His son was 1 phone call away, and he had been treating it for 5 long years like it was the hardest repair in the world. when the truth was that he had simply been too proud and too scared to pick up the tool. The hardest things to fix were almost never the ones under the hood. They were the people. They had always been the people, and it was almost never too late, while they were still here, while they were still somewhere on the other end of a silence, waiting to hear from a man brave enough to break it first.